Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you so much, Patricia. Like she said, my name is Udi Lazimi, and I'm really excited to be here to share with you guys. It is such an honor. I've seen startup CPG grow from, I think it's very early stages when I used to work with Daniel Scharf. And not only that, but we have a very fun relationship playing music together. If you've heard the 𝗃𝗃𝗆𝗆𝗆, that's also me on guitar there. So it's a lot of fun, and I'm really honored. Today, I'm gonna share some thoughts from my experience and from the work that I do with brands, many of which are probably quite similar to yours. And I'd be so honored to meet you all individually. Hopefully, we'll have a chance. At the end, I'll share my contact info and a Calendly link, a QR code, so you guys can set up some time if you'd like to chat. I really hope you do, because I'd love to hear more about your stories, your challenges, and see how I can help. So without further ado, today I'm going to talk a little bit about sourcing strategies, kind of background on sustainable sourcing, as well as measuring impact. So I'll start off with talking about who I am, why I'm here, kind of why maybe you might gain some insight in working with me in growing your brand, and how I can be of service. And then I'll talk about sourcing, why it's so important for understanding the impact of your brand and building your brand. And then finally, we'll go through some basics of impact assessment, or life cycle assessment, as they call it, the building blocks. We'll go through an actual case study, kind of an idea or a format of how you might build a life cycle assessment. And I'll also kind of be taking a journey with you and bringing you along around the world. All of these photos aren't in the presentation, are from sourcing projects that I've led. And the first one was in what's called a mandi, which is in India, like a grain auction where you go and you buy. Farmers come from hundreds of kilometers around and bring their produce, their grains, whatever they've grown, and people buy them right there on the spot. This is me in a farm in Rajasthan, and I just love the colors and the way that people around the world grow food, and that's one of my passions. So who I am. Most recently, I spent just under 7 years as the global head of sourcing and sustainability for a brand that some of you might know. I'll describe it in a couple slides after this as well, but it's Eat Just, the makers of Just Egg and Good Meat. Good Meat is the first to market cultured meat brand in the world, and Just Egg is, I'll talk about that in a second as well. But now, since leaving Just, I consult and advise plant-based and cell-based food brands, many of which might be like you. And I also work with global agencies and organizations to help promote alternative proteins. I work with food tech innovators, et cetera, focused on sourcing and impact strategies. I have an MBA in sustainable business and a master's in public affairs. Here are some of the brands I've been honored to work with and support and provide my services to. Here on the right is me with a really fun, quirky guy in Myanmar, where he's trying to sell some of their local grains, and that was just an incredibly beautiful experience to see how they do business in Myanmar, or Burma, if you will. So just a bit of background again on me. Who am I? Where was I? Just Egg, where I was the head of sourcing and sustainability. Best-selling plant-based egg in the world. For a time, it was the best-selling frozen breakfast at Whole Foods. Many of you will have heard many of the accolades about the egg. Raised over 500 million, I think well over 500 million at this point. Got through Series F funding as of this year, I believe. And at Just, as head of sourcing, we started out with what we call the discovery platform, where I built a plant library of thousands of different samples of plants that I sourced from all over the world to fuel this discovery program, where we would determine kind of what kind of benefit could we gain from plant proteins in the food system? How could we change the food system to eliminate really unsustainable animal-derived ingredients and use plants instead? And one of those plants that we discovered was the mung bean, which you see here, from beans that I brought back from Southeast Asia. And we built that Just Egg product out of that. And I consequently built one of the world's largest regenerative supply chain partnerships for sourcing of alternative proteins in the plant-based food sector, which really is what fuels Just Egg today. This is me in Inner Mongolia. I'm not here to say where specifically 𝐸𝐻 sources from. I will not be discussing that, but I will say, I will describe some of the fun adventures that we had along the way in building various supply partnerships, and some of them may or may not be still in existence today. So just a quick background on challenges that CPG brands face. They face many, as you know. Plant-based foods are just as challenged as any other. The business building blocks of a food company are fairly similar in many cases. Sourcing, supply chain challenges, understanding the impact of your unique products and novel ingredients, how to assess that. Obviously fundraising, product formulation, discovering functional proteins, if that's your game, if that's what you're into, if that's what you're working on. Demand forecasting, that's a huge one. Reaching price parity with what you might be trying to replace. And obviously the biggest one arguably is building consumer awareness, changing consumer behavioral patterns, marketing, and getting your ingredient out there into the retail and food service space, distributor adoption, et cetera, et cetera. This farmer he's growing mustard seed in India. We literally just pulled off on the side of the road and had a chat with him as he was moving his irrigation. The photo is not very good; it's a little blurry, but it was really fascinating to see how things operate in. This was in Maharashtra in north central India. So, why does it matter? Why should you source sustainably? And what are the pillars? I'll talk a little bit about the benefits of sustainable sourcing and of direct sourcing. I'll talk a lot about how do you work up the supply chain, go upstream to get as close to the source as possible. 3 real pillars of sustainable sourcing are, of course, transparency, knowing what you're getting, where you're getting it from, who are the players along the way. It's a critical aspect of sustainability and responsible sourcing. Of course, sustainable production, agricultural production, manufacturing, all the different elements along the value chain of operations. Is it organic? Is it regenerative? What are the different practices? They might not be either of those. They might just be, word of mouth from a trusted source of farmers on the ground, and understanding how they do what they do, and being able to tell that story is really important. And so, of course, that directly lends itself to your impact assessment, the benefit of understanding what is the impact, be it whatever metric, whatever KPI you're looking at. And I'll talk about that later on. Be it carbon emissions, be it water, et cetera. And then, a third pillar, of course, is the fairness of the trade. And that's not, that's, of course, all the way to the farmer, the community. What are you supporting? How are you supporting your suppliers, your growers. How do you know? A lot of that comes all the way back to transparency again, but ensuring ethics, ethical trade, etc., is really important. But then also, I see this as being important throughout the entire business. Internally, of course, this is a big part of ESG. How are you treating your employees, all the different folks within your team, as well as outside of your team. And then of course, there are many other aspects of sustainability, especially in sourcing, be it packaging, transportation. If you're offsetting, if you're reducing your carbon emissions, etc., how are you doing that? And so on and so forth. But really fundamentally, what I tend to say a lot, and what I truly believe, and why I believe I bring a lot of benefit to brands as they're growing, is that sourcing is an art. It truly is, and it's at the core of understanding your food brand's impact on the planet and on communities, and on your consumers. Impact assessment, understanding your impact, really does begin with sourcing strategy. And here we are walking through some fields in Inner Mongolia. So what I like to say, when we were building Just Egg and other products at Just, and what I tell brands now is, it's not just about what's not in your product. It's not just about, okay, we're replacing eggs, we're replacing meat, we're replacing a dairy protein, etc. But it's really about what is in your product. Plant-based food companies and others, they often focus only on what they're eliminating or displacing, such as animal protein, dairy, eggs, etc. But true sustainability demands that your core ingredients are not only sustainable themselves, but also sourced responsibly. And there's a lot more scrutiny on that today, and people are asking, and it generally, even if they weren't, it's just such a core part of the mission of brands these days, especially in the natural products industry. And here we are back in the Mandi I think this is in Cotter in northwestern India. But an example of sustainable ingredients, even when you're using alternative proteins, and how to drive even greater impact, is, I like to talk about the mung bean because, we stumbled upon that after I brought some home from Asia and developed Just Egg, but it also happens to be one of the world's most sustainable legumes, or pulses as they call it. These legumes that are grown throughout the world, rich in protein. And, if you look at this protein source of the mung bean, for example, and there are others, 𝗧𝗍𝐾 is in the same family, the Vigna genus, you find that it in terms of carbon footprint, based on international industrial production standards, it kind of blows away a lot of the other popular proteins, more so than, more carbon efficient, if you will, than soy, certainly corn, but peas. I threw peas in here, actually. It wasn't in there before, but it's more than half of the average carbon footprint of the same volume of peas. Certainly wheat, and then rice and eggs on the far right. You might be surprised rice is so carbon intensive. Well, that's generally lowland wet rice cultivation, where they completely flood the fields with water, thus kind of starving the soil and making it impossible to breathe, and thus creating it therefore stops the carbon cycle, and is one of the biggest emitters of carbon, of CO2, sorry. And that's on par with industrial produced eggs per kilo. Okay, so we're talking about sourcing, going up the supply chain, working with farms, but I get it. You know, many startups aren't there yet. You're focused on what the hell are you making? You're focused on how are you going to raise money? You're not so focused on like, where am I going to get the ingredients? Maybe you're thinking about sustainability, and I argue that it's a critical component. But for now, you know, focus on sourcing what you can as sustainably as possible. And I work with folks and can help with that too. But you know, if you're going to be doing that, here are some ideas. You know, we all know about these certifications. It's a dizzying world. It's complex. There's a lot of them out there. Some of them you might not even use. You might not use any of them. We never were certified for most anything, non-GMO certainly, at 𝐀𝐿. But it is beneficial to think about. It's really, really important when you're talking about sustainability and sourcing. Some of the ones that I really like, B Corp, it's a gold standard for measuring your company's entire social and environmental performance. It is self-reported, but it's very robust, and it's a great community of folks. Fair trade is a great standard for a good handful of ingredients. Understanding, you know, the ethical standards and ethical practices that Fair Trade USA and Fair Trade International make sure of when you use their ingredients. I very much stand by still the USDA organic label. Prior to joining Just, I was the National Policy Advocacy Director for the largest sustainable agriculture advocacy organization in the US, the National Sustainable Ag Coalition. I was also the head of policy advocacy for the Organic Farming Research Foundation. You know, these are the folks that created the organic label over 30 years ago. And it still stands as one of the most strict, robust organic agricultural practice standards or sustainable agricultural practice standards in terms of at least what you do and do not use on the farm. But on top of that sits the regenerative organic standard, which was developed recently to some dispute, and it was developed mostly by a number of brands working together. You do have to be certified organic to receive the regenerative organic standard. So it is one that, again, I think is very robust and is growing around the world. And I stand by for sure. The Demeter certified biodynamic is another really good one. It does focus on both organic, regenerative, and interestingly and really importantly, something that has a Demeter certification has an ecosystem level view. So it's not just kind of what ingredients, what chemicals or pesticides, or kind of even just what practices are done to produce a crop, but how does the entire ecosystem function with, how does the agricultural production function within the ecosystem? And is it biodynamic, which is a really amazing, beautiful thing that Rudolf Steiner and his whole philosophy is applied here in this certification. Climate neutral for offsetting and reducing carbon emissions. When you're sourcing ingredients, you can look for sources that have climate neutral certification. It means that they're really working hard on offsetting or reducing their carbon emissions, and they're certainly measuring them. A few more good ones. Fair for Life. It's great social responsible certification. So a Carbon Initiative and many others. Rainforest Alliance certified, or UTZ as it was. If you're going to use palm oil, you should really only be using RSPO certified palm. And then for animal ingredients and animal products, animal welfare approved and certified humane. Of course, organic is also in there, but those are important for talking about, how do you vet, these different ingredients that you're sourcing. Things you should not trust. A lot of people don't know about this. A lot of people do. A lot of people argue about it. But it's indisputable that there are no official standards, certainly not regulated by any governing bodies for some of these claims. They basically mean nothing. 100% natural, all natural means nothing. You can say anything's all natural because that's not regulated. Locally grown. Yeah, could be locally grown. I think that's really awesome. I think our system should be locally grown. But what does it mean? There's no real agreed upon standard for that. Free range, pasture raised, etc. Certainly those might absolutely be true, but who's to say? And that's kind of the trouble there, right? I'm not saying you shouldn't believe it. I'm just saying you shouldn't necessarily build your brand on trusting these claims as, one way or another until you do the work of looking into it deeply. There's just no certification or like standard to lean on. You have to dig in yourselves. So that said, in the long run, you'll really be saving money and building deep brand value for your brand through more direct sourcing, through building more of your own supply chains. Even if you're small, even if you're getting started, there are still opportunities to do that. And I'll talk about that here in a second. But when I talk about direct sourcing, I'm talking about kind of, moving up the supply chain, up the value chain as close to the farm source as possible. You could be doing that in the US or around the world, versus just buying ingredients off the shelf. So, and again, here we are in Inner Mongolia with some of the food science team from Just and some of the other folks, and then working directly with the farmers, and just so much fun to get out there. That's one of the other benefits of going up the supply chain. Benefits of sourcing further up the supply chain. It's hard work, but it pays off in the long run. Number one, working with brands, I help them save money. It's something that is critical and a core component of building your own supply agreements and kind of going as far up as you can. You end up usually cutting out middle players, and long-term supply agreements can really help you avoid market fluctuations, especially if you're dealing with like cash crops, non-commodity and non-kind of globally price regulated crops. Transparency, as we said, it's a pillar of sustainable sourcing, and the further up the supply chain you get, the more transparent, the better. Having visibility up and down that supply chain is super beneficial, also because it allows you to then tell the story directly of your ingredients, of your products in your marketing efforts, and that's something that, of course, is invaluable. Third, quality, ensuring long-term quality consistency through those direct relationships. You're also able to like adjust the spec if you need something that's a little different from a processed ingredient or even a raw ingredient. You can work directly, much further up. It helps to it gives you more leverage. And then finally, the relationships are invaluable. And to this day, I talk to the folks that I met 7-8 years ago when going out on sourcing journeys and adventures. And then, of course, those business relationships, those business partnerships. It's just like any other relationship. And it really, the closer you are to the source, the better the outcome. So here's an example, a few examples of kind of where you might plug in, where you might enter if you're sourcing up the supply chain. Taking again, for example, the mung bean. It's an interesting example because if you want a mung bean protein isolate, it's really difficult to get these days. It's not there yet. Something that I'm working on is promoting this. Additional, diversity in protein sources that are available in the US and elsewhere. But a lot of time you got to go up the supply chain and see how you can influence it and work directly with the players so that you can get the best price that you could potentially never get if you're just buying it, from brokers or off the shelf or distributors. So for example, after, I don't know if you can see my cursor, you probably can't, but maybe you can. After the beans are grown, they either go off for the sprouting market, which, end of the game right there. You don't have to do anything more to the beans, and you can go in and buy directly from those processors or exporters. But then, of course, you could also just buy the whole green mung beans to do something else with. You can plug in to the supply chain further up from the processors or exporters of what they call mung dal or other, semi-processed beans. Further down, you could be buying directly from the flour manufacturers. If they've then gone and milled the product into flour, you can buy directly from the mill, from the exporter, from the importer, or from a retail flour brand. And then finally, if it's being turned into something even further downstream, like starch or protein isolate, you can buy directly from those processors, exporters, etc. So there are many levels, many entry opportunities for direct sourcing that you can explore. Okay, just checking out the comments here real quick. Great. I'll go through these a little bit afterwards. So how do I close this? Sorry, one second. Okay. So if you are going to be, building supply chains, kind of working with, or even just working with folks overseas, for example, with smallholder growers, it takes work, but it pays off in the long run. How do you do that? What are the challenges? There are many challenges to, one of my slides is gone, but that's okay. One of the main challenges in sourcing is the lack of transparency between the raw ingredient, kind of the agricultural product, and manufacturing. There's just very little transparency there. You're usually buying a commodity or an ingredient from brokers. So buying and supporting directly from smallholder or underdeveloped sources and farm communities is challenging. Supply chain can lack transparency. There's really no farm level transparency. Lack of consistency is an issue. Middle players are taking cuts. And there's very little control that you might have as a brand. And then as well, smallholder farmers are often poorly resourced. Lack of training, lack of equipment, lack of financing, and sometimes you even find yourself sourcing from like questionable regions of the world and conflict zones and so on. So the opportunities here are tremendous, and there are a lot of ways to do this. There's a lot of ways to do this kind of without a lot of resources, without having to raise millions and millions of dollars. There are partnerships that you can develop to develop really phenomenal transformational supply chains and supply for your brand. And one of the opportunities, of course, is plugging into, leveraging, or creating on-the-ground support systems, working with folks on the ground in cooperatives and social enterprise groups, working with institutions for support and training of growers and of processors and aggregators on the ground, and then really having a commitment from you as a buyer is a really tremendous opportunity for folks to have a better livelihood and to provide you with the supply that you might need. Economics and financing are of course another huge component of the opportunity there, of what can be done, investment from the buyer. investment and financing from local institutions such as government agencies and local banks. And then, of course, just the economics of scale. Oh yeah, I forgot to take you on the journey. This is in Tanzania. These ladies are harvesting and processing sesame. This is baobab, again in East Africa. The seeds of the baobab tree. Very interesting taste, and it's just phenomenal what you discover when you go on the ground. So what we do is we really focus on scaling up sourcing, and this is kind of core to the strategy of sustainable sourcing, is scaling up while driving environmental and social benefit. And again, it's really important to get as close to the ground as possible, to work with local community leaders, government, build social enterprise networks, investing in regenerative ag, and then looking at the market level at, the cost plus model for long-term pricing, so that your costs are very, very low compared to what might be out there in the market, but you're also covering the costs of the growers. This is in Australia, Queensland, Australia. These are all photos that either I or a photographer that came along took. This is mung bean harvest in Australia. So that is kind of a summary of sourcing and some real basics on approaches to sustainable sourcing. I will just take a look real quick at these questions. Could I discuss the pros and cons for keeping sources of ingredients just in-house versus being transparent? That's a great question. Yeah, so, okay. You're going to answer the question live. Does that mean I answer the question right now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So it's a great question. I think, gosh, it depends on the product. So how processed is the product and how many minor ingredients, less than 2% ingredients are there. The major ingredients, being transparent with there's a balance between what you want to share, what is proprietary, and what makes sense. And so being as transparent as possible can mean something different for everybody. Like for us, for example, keeping our sources proprietary was important because when we're in such a relatively small market of say, for example, the proteins that we used, like mung beans, the commodity market or kind of like the biggest buyers in the world can go in and just buy up a tremendous volume and completely alter the price. And so it is important to keep kind of certain aspects of the source close to your chest, especially if you are subject to global pricing fluctuations. But if you're able to have really strong supply agreements, then you can minimize that again, directly with growers, directly with co-ops and communities. And yes, I think it's really important that you celebrate that and share about that, and kind of understand like what's most important to your consumer. So for example, transparency might say, okay, well, we source from this region of the world. Here are some stories from farmers. And you might not necessarily say like, this is the exact cooperative that we work with, depending on kind of the exposure and the risk to the price and to the supply that you might face by doing so because of the competitive nature of the ingredient market. So again, it depends on whether you're in a limited space where you're the first to develop something and it's incredibly competitive, or you're doing something with ingredients that are, much more abundantly available, and it's not as competitive of a landscape necessarily. And then another question, how do you measure and communicate impact for farms or farmers that don't want to be certified, but do practice sustainable ag? That's a great question. So you do exactly that. You say what's going on. You say what they're doing. You talk about it. You say potentially, the nature of the crop itself. So for example, wheat, wheat these days is actually grown fairly sustainably. Over the years, it's been developed to be a very, low water intensive crop, many other benefits to it. Same with canola. And so you just talk about kind of the general practices as you can and celebrate that. But if you can, try to get a certification, a certified product, because that just speaks volumes, because people trust those certifications. So for example, with a lot of pulses with 𝗧𝗏𝐾 or mung bean or many others, there might just not be enough volume of certified organic in the world. And that premium on that certified organic might not make sense for your costing model, but you can still tell the story of where it comes from. You can tell the story of kind of the fact that that crop actually inherently uses less water than many others, or has a lighter CO2 footprint. So, all right, I'm just going to go through quickly what it looks like. And Patricia, do you have any?
Oh, I was just going to say that Morgan actually posted a question on the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, if you guys can keep the questions in the Q&A, but that would be easier. But if you already want to answer her question, that's fine.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll talk about that here in a second. But there are databases out there and there are organizations, and I'd love for you to contact me afterwards. But there are third parties that you can work with that have really robust databases of ingredients. And then there are others like SEMA Pro, which is one of the most famous, that has a tremendous wealth of data around many ingredients out there. So there are a lot of resources for that. All right. So now let's talk about measuring and telling the story of your impact. So here we are back in Tanzania at the sesame harvest. Life cycle assessment for consumer packaged goods or plant-based foods. If you use sesame in your products, it could look like this, where it comes from, which is I thought was just like a really interesting, eye-opening way to learn about how sesame is harvested. So the core methodology, I'll talk a little bit about. This is like, I'll just go through again an example of how you might build a life cycle assessment or an impact assessment. The basic methodology starts with determining your goals. Who do you want to tell the story to? Who do you want to talk to? Are you talking to your consumers? Are you putting it on the label? Is it because you need to do a report? Is it to investors, etc.? And that might determine how and what you say or measure. Determine your scope. Are you determining, are you measuring climate, water, land, impact, etc.? It's important to know your uncertainties. And then finally, what I'll talk about here and break down is then conducting the impact assessment, within that scope, to be able to talk to those goals. So the steps for an impact assessment, this example of one, which is similar to one that we did at Just, and we built our own kind of custom-based impact assessment tool. Step one, just like Morgan was asking about, gathering data for your ingredients, and I'll break this down systematically. So you gather all the ingredient data. So based on whatever metrics you're looking for, aggregate the ingredients as a finished product. So you put all that data together per ingredient to create a combined product, whatever your product formulation is. You can then make a conclusion on the impact of your product alone. And then you can make claims. You can say, well, compared to this competitive product, our our product uses less water or less CO2 emissions, or based on, you know, the sales that we've enjoyed this year or in its lifetime, we've saved this much CO2. So just in a little bit more detail, gathering data related to those KPIs, we engage with partners that have built these custom-built these frameworks that are actualized as technology platforms which reference and compile information from multiple external data sets. The data sets come from various publicly available models, you know, such as emissions, kilos of greenhouse gas emissions emitted per unit of ingredient, or water use, liters of surface or groundwater consumed per unit of ingredient, or square meters of land required to produce the you know, a unit of an ingredient. Oops. Thinking about the boundaries of a impact assessment, you know, when you're thinking about all your ingredients, the sourcing program that you have and that you've built or that you want to build, you think about like the inputs such as fuel, electricity, surface water, groundwater. These are all part of the data set usually that are already included in the assessment for each particular ingredient that you will gather for your assessment. You know, crop cultivation, raw material processing, milling, extraction, processing, and then refining before you have a final ingredient. You have inputs for that, and you have, of course, outputs, which are generally a lot of the impact, but the emissions, the solid waste, you know, the side streams, etc., before you have a final ingredient. And the boundaries of the assessment, you know, fall within, you know, between kind of the inputs and those outputs. So step 2, aggregating the data. You take that ingredient data on the far left side of this image. You take all that left column is the ingredient impact per kg of ingredient. Then you kind of multiply that by the relative mass of that ingredient in the product. And you add that in to product level aggregation per kilo of whole product. And then you can multiply that by like the sales volume or the mass of each product in the case. And then you have your brand level ingredient impact total. And that can be like a sales-based summary or just looking at like one unit of your product versus the same unit of another product. So for example, you know, you can then conclude like, you know, that the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of our product or ingredient, this should say ingredient or product, the water use or the land use for the product, you know, on its own. And finally, you can then compare it to competitor products. And I'll talk about some case studies in just a second. But you're able to say here, you know, using this methodology that I work with partners to serve brands in doing this work, you're able to say, you know, our plant-based product, for example, uses 87% less water than X product, or we've saved the equivalent of 24 swimming pools of water. People love equivalencies, you know. We've saved the equivalent of 400 cars worth of CO2 emissions from our sales because we had done that assessment determining the impact of our product directly. So for example, a case study, this is what I was in charge of at Just, was determining the footprint of say Just Egg. We all know, you know, that we want to believe that, like, if you're making a plant-based product and based on, you know, all the published research, it is most likely going to be more carbon, less carbon emitting, less CO2 emitting, or other equivalent greenhouse gases, often less water intensive, etc. But you don't really know until you measure. And so that's what we had to do with with the egg, for example. And we determined that compared to conventional eggs, that Just Egg has 93% smaller carbon footprint, uses 98% less water, and 86% less land. And then on the far right there, based on at one point years ago, we could say, oh, we've sold 200 million egg equivalents per volume of product sold. So that means we've saved 7.2 billion gallons of water, or an equivalent, or 29 million kilos of CO2 avoided, if in fact we had displaced 200 million eggs. Not saying that we did, but at a 200 million egg equivalent, this is the impact. Another case study, real quick before I close, is the brand Regrained. I was the chief sustainability officer at Upcycled Foods Inc., or the makers of Regrained, previously known only as Regrained, before becoming Upcycled Foods. And we did this whole LCA where we determined that Regrained flour, which is a flour made from spent grain that's captured from the beer brewing industry. They dry it, mill it, and make flour out of it. It's mostly a food waste play, reducing food waste, but it also has a tremendous water benefit, and to a certain degree is beneficial with regards to CO2 emissions and land. And then finally, right, a brand can talk about the there we go. A brand can really talk about how its broader impact, what its broader impact is, these certifications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then so I'll close kind of with this question, for all of you. You are entrepreneurs, you are folks that are or operators, leaders of food brands. What now? And certainly I'd love to share with you some free resources, such as what I showed earlier, the different certifications, some of the steps towards creating an LCA, et cetera. I'd be more than happy to share that with you, and you can contact me directly through the link on the next page. But if you're ready to save money, if you're ready to save time and move forward and build a truly transformative supply chain and to really take your brand to that next level, I'd love to work with you, and again, contact me and let's chat about some of your challenges and see how we can support you. So with that, you can this QR goes directly to my calendar. You can set up some time and email me or check out the website udilazimi.com.
Thank you, Udi. That was awesome. Just to close, we have 2 more questions, but they are in the chat.
Check them out.
So one is from Morgan. Is there a recommended database for ingredients that have good sourcing or have obtained one of the recommended certifications? Yeah, so again, contact me. I can connect you to the folks that have those direct connections. A lot of times you need to have a membership for accessing the databases. There are some publicly available ones again, but so like SEMA Pro is a really good database. And there are some others. There are some partners. Planet Forward is a really good partner. How Good is a good partner, and I work closely with them to manage projects from the beginning to the end. And then good old Google has a lot of information, a lot of publicly research, a lot of good peer-reviewed research out there on an ingredient that you might be looking at. Great. And then what are some ways a startup without much market share might position itself as a partner to these produce sources? Should we focus on small farms at first, or are there ways to partner with bigger producers? It depends completely. This is why sourcing is an art. This is why I recommend that you get in touch, because it really depends on what you're sourcing. It depends on what you're working on. And it depends on from where and what's available. So if something is available in the US or in Canada or a more developed market, your dynamics for sourcing are going to be completely different than if you're working in the developing world.
working with smallholder growers, and everyone in between, where you might be buying from processors or distributors. You can definitely position yourself as a partner, depending on the volume that is grown by or produced or processed. It really just depends on what you're sourcing. If it's a unique ingredient, if it's a unique crop, a unique product, you can often build those direct relationships. But if it's something that's a huge commodity, you might still be able to build some of those direct relationships. It really just depends on what it is.
Okay, awesome. Well, I hope that answered your question. As Udi said, if you have any other questions, you can reach out to him. He's highly recommended by Daniel as well, so you guys can definitely trust. Udi, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge. I love to see the pictures when you were traveling. That was super cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And as I said in the beginning, we are sharing the recording and the slides with you all. So yeah, I appreciate everyone being here, and thank you so much for your time.
All right. Well, it's been an honor, and do reach out. I hope to meet you guys, and we'll chat soon. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.